when I was walking there.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful place to walk.
We're going to begin. I was a little preoccupied, as you might understand, and I actually did a lot of preparation. I didn't pull it all together the way I would have liked, but we were left with a couple of questions at the end of the last shiur, and one of them was about this lishka in the Lishkat Hamoked that was described as having been the place where the stones of the Mizbeach were buried, were put into Geniza. Let me just remind us of that Mishnah. It's Mishnah Middot. Just a second. Bring it up. Oops. There we go. Okay. Here, Masachet Midot. Here we go. Okay. So the Mishnot, just a second. Let's, I'm going to mute everybody. Okay. There were four chambers in the Beit HaMoked, were like small rooms that opened into a hall. Shtayim b'kodesh v'shtayim b'chol. Two of them were in Kodesh and two of them were in Chol, meaning two of them were in the part of Har HaBayit that was Kadosh, with the Kedusha of the area of Beit HaMikdash, and two of them were just outside of that area, that were in a non-holy area. Roshei Pispasim bein Kodesh l'Chol, and the head of the Pispasim would differentiate between the part that was Kodesh and the part that was Chol. By the way, there are different perushim about exactly what the Pispasim were. The way I described it last time was according to the Rambam, which seemed like there's a kind of a lattice work that comes down from the center of the room, or the part of the room where, where it goes from being Chol to Kodesh or Kodesh to Chol, depending on which side you're coming from. According to the Bartanur, it seems that they built it in the Chol part. They had beams on the ceiling, and the beams ended at the point where it was no longer Chol. And those are the heads of the piece. I'm going to do more of a focus on this next time. This is a lot of the preparation I did was to get a better understanding about all these aspects of the Beit HaMoked. And I decided to focus now on this one thing. And we're going to go on in the Mishnah, and then next week, God willing, we'll come back and pull some of these things together. Uma hayu mishamshot. All right, so there were these four rooms that were in the Lishkat Beit HaMoked, and what were they used for? So Maravit Dromit, the southeast room, Hi Haita Lishkat La'ei Korban. That was the room where they kept the sheep for the Korban Tamid. Dromit, the southeast room, Hi Haita Lishkat Osei Lechem HaPanim. That was the room that was used for the people who made the Lechem HaPanim. Mizrachit Tzfonit, the northeast room, Zu B'nei Hashmonai et Avesh Shiktsum Malchei Yavan. That's where the sons of the Hasmoneans stored away the stones of the Sur that had been defiled by the kings of Greece. And that's what we'll look at first in a moment. Sfonit Maravit Ba Yordim Bebeit HaTfilah. And then the northwest room, that's where they would go down to the place of Tavelin, right, to the move that was underneath. So, yes, I didn't prepare this for last time, but I was remembering when I learned this a long time ago that somebody talks a little bit more about this. What exactly is the story here with stones that were from the altar that had been defiled, and why were they buried? So the early source, I had some help from the Perush of Albeck, which is where I must have learned it originally. And he gives us he gives us some references. So the earliest story that we have that talks about this is in Sefer Maccabim. And in Sefer Maccabim, what I have on the screen is a Hebrew translation. If you may know that Sefer Maccabim was not included in Tanakh. There's the theory is that it was originally written in Hebrew, but we have no surviving original Hebrew versions. The surviving versions were Greek. Actually retrofitted to translated into Hebrew from the Greek. I'm not sure whose translation this is. It's a wiki text. I'm sure it says, and I'm not going to take time now to take a look. It's also in certain versions of the Christian Bible, and you can find it online also in English. But okay, so in Sefer Maccabim, we have, it starts off with the background. It basically begins with the death of Alexander the Great and what happened in the wake of his death and how his kingdom got divided up, and et cetera, et cetera. It goes down until it talks about how when it came to Israel, the king that had, for whom Israel was in their portion, wanted to enforce their laws, and this is of course appropriate now for Hanukkah, right? This is the Hanukkah story as told in Sefer Maccabim, and we're not going to go through all of it. I'm going to just skip to, in the first chapter, what happened to the Mizbeach. So we'll start a little bit earlier. In chapter 1, verse 41, it says, So the king, and there was the Hellenist king, wrote in his kingdom that all of them should be as one people, or one nation. Everybody should leave their laws, and all of the nations should take the word, they should accept the word of the king. Rabim Yisrael ratzu ba'avodoto, yizbachu le'elohim v'yechalu et Shabbat. So a lot of the people from Israel, in other words, a lot of the Jews, wanted to do this service of the king, and they were offering sacrifices to the god, and they were violating Shabbat. Vayishlach hamelech sfarim biyad malachim u'Yerushalayim u'arei Yehuda l'lechet acharei chukim lachrim ba'aretz. Right, so the king sent Sfarim, here it's not books, it means written, he said writs. We see it used in Esther, right? He sent out these writs in the hands of of his agents, of his messengers to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah to go after the laws of the strangers, his laws in the land. Noah olot, to stop doing or prevent doing olot zemach v'nesach min hamikdash v'lechalel tot ha'chagim. In other words, they should stop all of the service that they were doing in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, and they should be violating Shabbat and the holidays. So the Tamei Mikdash Ukadoshim, and they should also make the Mikdash and all of the holy things in the Mikdash Tamei. Livnot Bamot Vehechalot Upsilim Akriv Chazirim Ubehemot Tameot. They should set up bamot, right, which are altars that are outside of the mikdash are called bamot, and hechalot, I guess housings, and to set up idols, and they should offer up pigs and unclean animals, right, non-kosher animals. They should leave their sons to be without a brit milah, and they should defile themselves with everything that's tameh and abhorrent in this case, I'll say. They should forget the Torah, and they should exchange all of their laws for the king's laws. Anybody who doesn't do like the word of the king is going to die. So all of these things were written, he wrote them out to his kingdom. Right? So then he designated people to go out to the people and to make this command in the cities of Judah, and to be brought forth in each city. To be brought forth here could mean that they should do these korbanot of behemot tameot. So a lot of them, in other words, a lot of the Jews joined up with them. All of the people who left the Torah, and they did evil things in the land. So they put Jews, other Jews went into hiding as they were fleeing. In the 15th of Kislev, in the 145th year, it dates back to the beginning. It goes back to Alexander. It's using that as the starting point. Banu shikutz meshumam al hamizbeach. This is what's important for us. They built a shikutz meshumam al hamizbeach. They built a distinct, desolate thing on the altar. Uvarei Huda and misaviv banu bamot. And that's what they did in Jerusalem on the altar. And in the cities of Judah around, they built these bamot, right? These other sort of makeshift altars. So, and they in the openings of their houses and on streets, they would be making these offerings. And any Torahs that they found, they would burn in a fire as they were being torn. Right? Anybody who was found having a book of the covenant, like a Torah or any kind of Torah book, and anybody who desired the Torah, it was the law of the king that he should be put to death. So this is what they were, basically this is what they did in all of their in their attack. So this is also important. On the 25th of the month. So what was the month that we were talking about? So
Kislev.
right, so it's the 25th of Kislev. What happened? He grieved la bama shaita al hamizbeach. So that's when they start to bring korbanot on the mizbeach on 25th of Kislev. That hanashim asher malu et beneihen himitu piyada. The women who gave a brit to their sons, they were put to death according to the order of the king. And they hung the young, the infants around their necks. And the other people in their households and anybody who had given them a brit milah, they killed. But a lot of the people in Israel were strong, and they held up and they didn't eat anything that was tamei. They chose to die, rather than become tamei with these forbidden things to eat. And rather than eat tamei things, and rather than to violate the holy covenant by Yamutu. In fact, they died. So there was great anger that had been brought on Israel. So this, this is the worst parts of what was done. In the next chapter, it starts to talk about Matityahu and his sons, and how they started their rebellion. And again, I'm not going to go into the whole story. You should all take a look if you've never read it. It's quite fascinating. And I'm going to skip a little bit to where they managed to, after several important battles, they finally are able to retake Jerusalem and go back into the Beit HaMikdash. Just a second. Yeah. Third chapter. Yes. Here we go. Okay, so we're skipping quite a lot of the story. So I'm skipping now. This is chapter 4, verse 36. So this is after a major battle, which they win. At this point, the Yehuda Amar Le'achav, Judah Maccabee, who led the fight, he was the general. He says to his brothers, "Hine nakfu oivenu, or nikfu oivenu na'alel et hamikdash lechanchenu." So he says, our enemies have been smitten. Let's go up to purify the mikdash and to dedicate it. Right? So all of the camp, the army camp that had been fighting, they gather together and they go up to Mount Zion. They see the mikdash is now desolate and the altar has been violated and the gates have been burnt. The chatzerot gedelim sabachim kamo biyar, and in the courtyards there are like bushes or things that are growing like in a forest, right? So there was just a lot of vegetative growth that had happened there. The way you would see in a forest, or the way you might see in a mountain, and all of the lishkot that we're, even now that we're talking about these different compartments or rooms or part of the Beit HaMikdash, they were all desolate. So they tore their clothing. They cried a great cry. And they put ash on their heads. They fell on their faces to the ground. They blew the trumpets. The trumpets of blowing. And they cried out to heaven. So then Yehuda said to his people to fight those who were in the fortress. In other words, there were still foreign troops that were in the fortress there. And he said, well, fight them until we can purify the Mikdash. And he chose pure isn't the right word, but the right perfect Kohanim who were desirous of Torah. Tmimim here, I think, means, I would venture guess, it means that we know that these were Kohanim that were definitely Kohanim, and that they hadn't sinned in any of these defilements that they had been, that the Hellenist government was trying to force upon them. So they were still kosher to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Vayitaru et HaMikdash, and they purified the Mikdash. Vayotziu et avnei hashikutz l'makom tameh. So when they purified the Beit HaMikdash, they took out the defiled stones to an impure place. Vayivatsu ha-mizbach ha'olah, mizbech ha'olah, ha'mechulal, ma la'asot lo. And so they took counsel, right? They were to figure out what to do with the altar that had been defiled. But tzach aleihem machshava tova, so they succeeded in having a good thought, or they were wise enough to have a good thought, lintot zoto, to break it up, levilti hayot lahem lemokesh, so that it would not for them as a stumbling block. Ki agoyim tzu vayitzu et hamizbech. So what does it mean that it would be for them like a mokesh, like a stumbling block? What's the problem that they were facing? Anybody who wants to talk, remember to push your space bar. Right? They come back. The Mizbech, it says, has been defiled. So what's the problem that they have to solve?
Is it possible that since the Mizbeach was Tameh, that it would make them Tameh?
Well, no, not necessarily. I would say there's a similar problem. The Mizbech is a prominent thing in the area of the Beit HaMikdash. And even though the layouts that I've been showing you of the Beit HaMikdash was actually not exactly the mesh that they had, right? Because we're looking at Herod's temple when we look at those pictures. But still, the Mizbech is a big thing. It's in the courtyard of the Azara. And what's the problem? What's the problem with having a Mizbech that has been defiled?
You can't remove it from the place because of the kaka, and we have in Shekalim, or perhaps I remember in Middot. So with Kelim we can clean, but not Mizbeach. Either the Choshet and Zahav. So that's a problem, how to destroy and put the stones Achat b'achat b'chutz, or it's very complicated because it's to have it's impossible to redo. It's immobile.
Well, it's not so much that it's impossible to remove, but more what the other said. It's that sin. It has now been used for avodah zarah. It no longer can be used for the Beit HaMikdash. We can't use it for any holy purpose. And unlike other kelim, right? Metal kelim, we can there's a process that we can tubble, we can kasher, right? But we can't do that with a stone mizbeach.
Yeah.
So what do you do with it? So what they decide to do is they decide they're going to break it up, and וינחו את האבן על הר הבית במקום מיוחד, עד בוא נביא להורות עליהם. So they take the stones and they put them on Har Habayit in a special place until a Navi will come and teach them about them, or tell them what to do with them. Right? Because so to understand this part a little bit better, and I apologize also because I didn't prepare this as well as I would like to, but the Gemara talks about this in Masechet Avodah Zarah. And here we're looking at Avodah Zarah Nun Bet Amud Bet. The discussion here has to do with things that have become dedicated to Avodah Zarah, and what one can or can't do with them. So it's quite a fascinating sugya, but I'm going to skip the beginning. I'm going to skip a lot of stuff that came before and just cut to the chase that has to do with what we're talking about here. And in fact, our case here about these stones is brought here as part of a larger discussion. So I won't go into the larger discussion, but I will get to this, right? Mizrachit tzfonit ba ganzu beit Hashmonai et avnei hamizbeach sheshikzu anshe Yavan. Okay, so the Gemara here is quote Mishnah that we just saw in Midot, that the northeast, what was the northeast Lishka in the Beit HaMokeh, that's where the house of the Hasmoneans put into Geniza the stones of the Mizbeach that had been defiled by the people of Greece. Marav Sheshet Sheshikzu Lavodah Zarah. Rav Sheshet said, what does it mean that they defiled them? They defiled them because they were used for Avodah Zarah. Right, and so things that have been used for Avodah Zarah are, in any event, asur, right? You're not allowed to derive benefit from things that have been used for Avodah Zarah. Amar Rav Papa, so Rav Papa says, Hatam Kra Ashkach V'darash. The way the Gemara is being phrased here, it has to do with a wider discussion, but just to understand in our context, Rav Papa says that regarding these stones that were found in the Beit HaMikdash, they found a verse and darshed it. And the verse is from Yechezkel. In Yechezkel it says, Ubao ba pritzim v'chalalua. This is one of the visions of Yechezkel, and again, we'll just take the immediate pasuk. He says, I turned my face from them, v'chilalu et tzfuni, uba'u ba paritzim v'chilalua. People broke in. He's talking about in the Beit HaMikdash, outsiders came and broke in and they defiled it, or so the chalel literally means to make something chol, to make it profane, to make it chol, kodesh. And what Rav Papa understands from this is that, here, Rashi explains, Hatam kra ashkach v'darush. So over there, regarding the stones that were from the altar at the time of the Hasmoneans, they found a verse and they darshaned it. That what? Demidioraita asiri afilu lehediot. That from Torah law, these stones are going to be forbidden for any use, even for non-holy use. Because of this vision of Yechezkel, where he says that Paritzim came and they made it chol. So Rashi explains, from the time that idol worshippers came into the Heichal, right? So we'll just say generally the Beit HaMikdash, Yatsu ilav lechulim. Once they came in, all of the vessels, but also including the Mizbeach in this case, became chol. They lost their status as things that are kadosh. Since they are now chol, kaninhu behefkera. So those idol worshippers, once these things became chol, they halachically took possession of them. I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. V'havu luhu didhu, and then they owned them. They were theirs. And then when they used them for avodah zarah, they became asur. So there's a certain halachic mechanism that's being described here, because the argument is, there's an argument that's raised earlier that if idol worshippers come in and they just start using the, let's say, the altar to bring their avodah, to bring the avodah zara on, they didn't really defile the altar per se, because they didn't own it. And a person, there's a halachic concept that a person can't be mekadesh or mechalel something that he doesn't own. So what Rav Papa is saying here is, this is the way the Hasmoneans, though, understood what happened based on this pasuk, that uba'u ba paritzim b'chilaluha, when the paritzim came in, these idol worshippers came in, they made everything chol. By the mere fact that they came in and took over, that removed the kedusha of the kelim and the mizbeach. Once that happened, that was a transformation of the object from something kodesh to something chol. And so by changing it, they halachically achieved ownership of it. So then when they brought their korbanot on the mizbech, then it really did become a thing of avodah zarah, because it belonged to them and they could do with it what they wanted, and they made it into an object of avodah zarah. Okay, so it's a little complicated, but that's the way that this is the beginning to understand the halachic mechanism of what went wrong, as it were, with the mizbeach. So the Gemara goes on, Amri said, in other words, the Hasmoneans, after they came in, like we saw in Sefer Maccabim, Hechi na'avid. How should we act? What should we do now? Nitvarinhu. Should we break it up? Avanim shleimot, amar Rachmana. When the Torah describes the Mizbeach, it says it has to be whole stones. You weren't allowed to break them. Ninasrinhu, should we be cut up? Lo tanith alehem barzel. The Torah also says about the Mizbeach that you're not allowed to pass any iron object over it, any iron kli. Amar Rachmana. So they were. This was. Yes, please.
Yes. On one side, they say that the stones are now whole. On the other hand, they say there's still some kedusha inside the stones, because if they were really whole, they could do with them. They could throw them away. It's something something strange about their. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I understand. So,
מה המהות שלהם? כן, אני לא בדיוק מבין. האם הם קדושים או הם חולים?
no, it's a good question. And I'm not sure I have a full answer for you. So I'm going to try to wing it a little bit.
I know there is a geniza for things which were Kodesh, but I think they are still Kodesh. If you have a Sefer Torah, which has been an old Sefer Torah, you should put it in the Geniza, or some which has been partly destroyed in a pogrom or something like this. But I think it's still Kodesh when you put it in the Geniza.
No, it is. So I think we may understand the question a little bit better from the next part of the Gemara. Hold on a second. So the Gemara seems to address your issue. And the Gemara so wait, before we go to the next part of the Gemara, just a second. I just want to keep up with Rashi as we're going. So Amri, Hanach de Beit Hasmoneans kishenitzchum hechi navi, right? So these people from the Hasmoneans, when they were victorious, they said, how should we handle this? What should we do? Nitvarinhu al yedei oved kochavim kedei levatlan. Should we break them up using a non-Jew to break them up in order to be mevatel otam, to void them from their present status? And there's a certain halachic reason they would have to do it by a goy. They're allowed to do it themselves. But avanim shleimot, shein behem pigimot, right? They have to be whole stones that don't have any kind of flaw in them. Right? So even a little flaw in it that was done by just like the tip of a sword, or tip of a knife, is enough to be posel the stone. Maybe we should, after they were broken, lashvot bekibatan, to even out the surface of wherever there were flaws. But the Torah says, "Lo tanif alehem barzel," ktiv v'amdu v'ganzum. So they decided to put them into Geniza. So the Gemara here goes on. It says, "Ve'amai." So why? What's the problem? Litvarinhu. Let them break them up. Break up these stones. And then people can take them themselves. Milo Amar Rav Oshia. So this, now they're going to bring an analogy. The analogy is a little bit, it's a little hard to follow. I was going over it a few times to make sure I understood it, and I hope that I understand it well enough to explain it. So, Mi lo Amar Rav Oshia. Didn't Rav Oshia say ביקשו כל כסף וזהב שבעולם, משום כספה ודהבה של ירושלים. Rav Oshia said they wanted to put in Geniza all of the silver and gold in the world because of the silver and gold that came from Jerusalem. And so they asked on this, Yerushalayim havia ruba dalma, Yerushalayim, most of the world. Elam, I'm just going to read this and then I'll explain as best I can. Elamar Abaye, rather Abaye says, Bikshu lignos dinara hadriana turyana shifa. They wanted to put into Geniza the coins that had the image of Hadrian or Turyanus, or that had been rubbed out, bibnei tiv'a shel Yerushalayim, because of the nature, because of the matbeot, because of the coinage that came from Jerusalem. Ad shematzula mikra min haTorah, until they found a pasuk in the Torah, shuhu mutar, that's permitted. And what's the verse? It's the verse that we learned before, Ubal ba pritzim v'chilulua, that when Paritzim came in, they made them. So the analogy is like this. Oshia says there was a time after the destruction of the temple and after it was looted, so among the things that were looted from the temple and from Jerusalem and its destruction would have been all the money. And the money, of course, at that time was coins. And the coins were mainly used, it was assumed that most of the coinage that was in Jerusalem was coinage that had been used to buy banot, or things for the Beit HaMikdash. So coins themselves, or other things, maybe from Aser Sheni. But there was an assumption that a lot of those coins are going to be kadosh. And so there were people who felt after the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed that, like, since we don't know exactly which coins came from Jerusalem, we have to put them all into Geniza, right? As if that would be possible, but it means like that was the assumption that that in principle, all of the coinage that they might come across, maybe it was really kadosh and you couldn't do anything with it. So, right. So that's what the Gemara brings from Rav Oshia. But then they asked on that, what? And Jerusalem is most of the world. In other words, once the coinage left Jerusalem, it went out into the wider world, and you could say now it's batel. So, like, what was their problem? It lost its status when it went out into the wider world, because Jerusalem itself doesn't comprise the entire world. So Abai said, no, actually they had a slightly different problem. It's not that they wanted to take out of circulation or to put into Geniza all of the coinage in the world, specific coins that were commonly used in the Second Temple. The coins that had the image of Hadrian or Trojanus, or coins that had been so rubbed out that you couldn't no longer see the image. Those were the things that they were worried had come from Jerusalem. And that was a real concern until they found a verse that they darshaned that allowed them, that told them that actually no, that all of that coinage is mutar. And that's the verse from Yechezkel, which they also understood to mean that when the Paritzim came and looted Jerusalem, they turned all of the things they took into chol, right? So now whatever kedusha the matbeot coins had before would have been lost, and so that was a halachic thing that they no longer had to worry about. So this goes to the question that Paul asked. So what was really the problem that was facing the Hasmoneans? They could just have broken up the rocks and used them for whatever they wanted, because they were chol. And we know that this is halachically acceptable because this was the same reason it was used for people to not worry about what coins they might use. Even if they were coins that may likely have been used for something kadosh, but by the time that, after destruction of the temple, they became chol. So that it should also be true for the stones of the altar. So the Gemara says, Hatam lo ishtamshu bahu ligavoa. But there, by the coins, they were not used ligavoa for a higher purpose. In other words, there wasn't actual avodah done with those coins. They were a means of buying things to do the avodah. But the altar, hacha kevan ishtamesh buhu ligavoa, here, because the stones had been used for an actual avodah, lav orach ara ishtamushe buhudyota. So it's not derech eretz. It's not seemly that they should be used for common purpose. So that seems to be the Gemara's answer to your question, Paul.
I still don't understand the analogy with the coins, because before the destruction of the temple, the temple got a lot of money from Machatzit shekel. They obviously wanted to use this money, so it was even bli chilul al yedei paritzim. I don't understand why they couldn't use it. Why would this money be kadosh? Because they obviously would like to buy the korbanot or whatever they bring. They have to buy for the avodah.
Right. So there's a certain halachic mechanism whereby the money, let's say, money that was money that would be used, let's say, for bedek habayit or the machzita shekel and so forth. So all the time when it's just being stored as money, it has a kedusha, and then when it's used in exchange for goods, it becomes chol. And similarly, like when you're hodeh maaser sheni, so who had to bring people who didn't want to bring their maaser sheni to Jerusalem, right? Just to remind us that if you were a farmer and you had crops, or you had whatever fruits or crops, so after you truma for the kohen, and after you took maaser rishon to give to the Levi, and after he took truma from his maaser and gave that to the kohen, then on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years, you had to take another maaser, and you were supposed to take that and bring it to Jerusalem to eat. But if you didn't want to schlep it to Jerusalem, then you could redeem it with a coin, and you had to specifically use coins. And so you would, whatever its value was, you would take that value of coinage and add a fifth, add 20%, and then you would take that coinage to Jerusalem, and there you would buy food and eat it in Jerusalem. So also the coins there of Maaser Sheni, they have a kedusha until you would use them to buy whatever you're going to eat. And then you have to eat that kedusha in Jerusalem under certain circumstances. And we may touch on that next week because it's sort of tangentially related to the question of the placement of Beit HaMokeh. So any coins that would have been used for the Beit HaMikdash or for Maaser Sheni, they're going to have a kedusha until they're nifdeh, right? Until they've been redeemed with whatever it is you're getting in exchange for them. So it seems that Mara wants to understand the problem that was facing the Hasmoneans with the stones was that on the one hand, the stones had become chol, because they technically had become chol, but because they had been used for actual avodah, they weren't entirely sure what to do with them. And that's why they take them and they bury them, and and as it said in Maccabim, they left them there until a Navi would come and tell them what to do with them. So they couldn't just simply destroy them and get rid of them, or take them and use them for whatever purpose they want. And on the other hand, then you keep using them for the Mizbeach. So that's exactly the safek that they were presented with. And that seems to be the conclusion. So we saw in Maccabim, they buried them on Har Habayit. So the place they're buried ends up being one of the lishkot of the Beit HaMoked. It ends up being that part, and it's in one of the parts of the Beit HaMoked that's chol. It's not in a kadosh part, but it's right next to the area of the Beit HaMikdash. And presumably, now I didn't find anything specific about this, but my guess was they wanted to keep them in the same area as the Beit HaMikdash, because if a Navi comes and tells them that you could use them, maybe they would want to restore them to be the Mizbeach. So they wanted to have them nearby. Or else, I don't know, maybe somebody else has an idea about why they kept them there. But that seems to be the case.
So they built a new Mizbeach? They brought new stones to build a new Mizbeach?
Yes, they built a new Mizbeach, and eventually in our Limudim, we'll talk about the Mizbeach is described in great detail. I showed you some of it. We talked about a little bit of the Midot of the Mizbeach. There's actually a description of how it was built in Masechet Midot. But these stones, though, were set aside. They were kept aside. And appropriately enough, on the heels of Chanukah, we got to see a little bit of the Chanukah story and how it relates to this Mishnah. Now, the other thing I want to show you, which is quite interesting, the Albeck also points to a couple of other sources. And one of them is Megillat Ta'anit. Hang on a second. I must have closed the window. Hold on one second, I can bring it up. Oops. Oh no, hold on a second. Here we go. So you may remember we discussed Megillat Ta'anit in earlier Shiurim. Megillat Ta'anit records all kinds of dates when different miracles happened, when you're not supposed to fast on those days. You weren't supposed to fast you're not supposed to fast or hespedim, or eulogize on those days, and the day before them and the day after them. And by the time of the Gemara, there was agreed that most of Megillat Ta'anit was batel, but it's a very interesting source. In other words, halachically, most of these things no longer apply. But there's this interesting passage.
Is
Yes.
Megillat Ta'anit a Sefer Chitzoni, like Sefer Maccabim?
It's not, no, it's because it's interesting. It's an interesting question because, Sefer Maccabim is written like a narrative, and it's written in a style like earlier books of Tanakh. Megillat Ta'anit seems to be a slightly different style and seems to be more like an early forerunner of like Mishnaic literature. We'll read a little bit of it now. So it's not like a Sefer Chitzon that somebody would, I didn't think anybody would have ever thought that this should be part of Tanakh. Whereas there could have been a real diyun about whether or not Sefer Maccabim should be part of Tanakh. The Gemara doesn't mention that, but it's possible that such a diyun existed. But the
Megillat Ta'anit was, the Jews had it all the time, or it was like Sefer Maccabim?
The writing of it was probably sometime in the middle to late Second Temple period. So it was like a record of things it was like a record for halachic purposes of different dates and what occurred on those dates, so that we would know not to fast on those particular dates. So here's one of the things it says, Basrin v'tlata l'Marcheshvan. On the 23rd of Mar Cheshvan, Mistatar Suriga min Ezrata. The Soreg was I can't think of the word, like listor, like it was taken down, right? It was unbuilt. The Soreg was taken down from the Azara. So what's the Soreg? Soreg, it's not exactly clear exactly what the word means here. Like we know what Soregim are in modern Hebrew. In other words, it's some kind of we'll just say kind of a structure that was in the Azara. So it was in the Azara of the temple, the courtyard of the temple. Because the Goyim, and I have a critical edition. There's another version here that says the Yavanim, that the Greeks or the Hellenists built some there. They built a place there. That's where they put prostitutes. And when the house of Hasmoneans had the upper hand, in other words, they were able to reclaim the Beit HaMikdash, Nadluhu mehen, they took it from them, V'satru, and they tore it down. Matzu sham avanim tovot, they found good stones there. Or avanim tovot could either mean that the thing itself had been built of stone and they realized that the stones were like of good quality. Or avanim tovot, maybe it means that they found jewels there, they found precious stones. It's not exactly clear to me. V'nimnu alehen, and they took account of them, or they took like a poll among people there. Or I think that this is parallel to the language that we saw in Sefer Maccabim, that they took counsel, vayivatsu, right? They had to like discuss what to do. V'ganzutam, and they buried them. V'hen munachot ad hayom hazeh, ad sheyavo Eliyahu v'ya'id alehem im tmeod hen, im tahorot, right? And they're resting there until this day, until Eliyahu will come and testify about them, whether they are impure or whether they are pure. Yom shisatruhu asu'uhu yom tov. So the day that they took it down, they made into a holiday. So this it's not it doesn't seem to be talking about the Mizbeach, but about some other structure, but its story is very much parallel to the story of the Mizbeach. Or else, it also occurred to me that maybe it means that the structure built was a structure that was built on the altar. And that's where the altar was pretty big, and they could have put like a room there at the top for the, or however they handled their prostitutes, I don't know. But it looks like the considerations here were very similar, although not precisely the same, as the way we saw in Sefer Maccabim, or the way the Gemara talks about the altar, but this seems to be parallel to that there was some structure that they took down, the stones were good, they didn't know what to do with them, if they could use them or not, so they're put into Geniza until, here it doesn't say a prophet, it says specifically Eliyahu will come in the future and tell them what to do. So I thought that was quite interesting. Since we're here, Gilat Ta'anit, I didn't prepare this, but, and we may have looked at this a few years ago. This is where Gilat Ta'anit talks about Purim. Esrim l'chamisha b'Kislev, the 25th of Kislev. By the way, it's just to point out, it's interesting. So it turns out that based on the Gilat Ta'anit, there actually is a holiday at Cheshvan. In fact, there's another one, even another two. Nowadays, we don't have any holidays in Cheshvan, right? There's no special days. So that's an interesting thing just to point out. So here, this is where Megillat Ta'anit talks about Purim, 25th of Kislev, Besrim l'chamna be Chanukta Tamanya Yomin di lo lemisped baham. Right, the 25th of Kislev, that was Chanukah, it was the dedication, 8 days that one does not eulogize. And here it explains the history. When the Greeks came into Beit HaMikdash, Timu kol hashmanim shebehechal, they impurified all of the oils that were in the Echal. And when the Hasmoneans overpowered them and were victorious, Badku, they checked, they only found one vessel that was placed in the seal of the high priest that had not become tameh. There was only enough there to light one day. So a miracle occurred, and they lit from it for 8 days. So in another year, they fixed those 8 days as 8 days of a holiday. And why did they? How did they see fit to make Hanukkah 8 days? Hanukkah being the dedication of the Mizbeach, and as we saw in Sefer Maccabim, right, the dedication of the Mizbeach was on the 25th of Kislev, and it was 3 years to the day that it had first been defiled. So, but why did they decide to do it 8 days? Right? The dedication of Moshe in the wilderness was only done for 7 days. Right? When it talks about when it leads up to Parshat Shmini, right? It talks about the Yemei Miluim, which was the dedication of the Mishkan. The Kohanim were not allowed to leave the opening of the Ohel Moed for all 7 days during that time of its dedication. The Gomer. The Omer Vahina Makriv B'Yom Rishon et Korbano the Gomer. Vashvi'i B'Ephraim, right? So this is later on when the Nesiim in Parshat Naso each bring their gifts to, everybody dedicates all these things to bring each of the Nesiim from each of the tribes. Each day brings a gift to the Mishkan. So this is also what we see in Hanukkah that Shlomo did when he dedicated his temple. He only did it for 7 days. It says there in Melachim that the dedication of the Mizbeach they did for 7 days. So what did they see to make this Chanukah 8 days? בימי מלכות יוון נכנסו בני חשמונאי להיכל ובנו את המזבח וסדוהו בסיד וכל 7 הימים היו מתקנים בכלי שרת. So this is how they tell this part of the story, that in the days of the Greeks, the sons of the Hasmoneans came in Beit Mikdash. They built the altar, they coated it with lime, and for 7 days, they were fixing the vessels that were used for service in the temple. Chanukat Beit Hashmonai L'Dorot, V'lami hi noheged L'Dorot, El she'asu b'tzeitam mitzarot l'ravacha. So the dedication of the house of the Hashmonaim is done for all generations, right? In other words, we don't have a holiday that commemorates the Hanukkah of the Mishkan. We don't have a holiday that commemorates the Hanukkah of Shlomo's temple. So why do we have a holiday for all the generations for the Hanukkah of the Hashmonaim? Why is it practiced for all generations? Because this was different. The other ones, I'll just add in my own, 2 cents. The other Chanukkot, the other dedications, those were done, in peacetime. And they were, of course, exceptional events, but they were events that were one-time events. But here, the Hanukkah story is a story of being saved from great sorrow and great trouble to a victory and to happiness and all, the Ravacha. So, and as a result, they said Hallel and they gave thanks and they lit candles b'tahara. The fee, now this is where it also gets a little bit interesting. The fee shnesu Yevanim behechal, because the Greeks came into the Beit Mikdash, v'timu kol hakelim. Here it feels like this part of Megillat Ta'anit is actually putting together different stories, right? So this is a slightly different story than was told a moment ago. They came in, they made all of the vessels that were in the temple. V'lo haya bameh lahadlik. When the Hashmonaim came in, there was nothing for them to light with, because the menorah had become tameh. So it wasn't a question here of the oil. It was a question that they didn't have a kli, they didn't have a vessel of any sort to light the lights that you need to light in the Beit HaMikdash. So when the Hasmoneans were victorious, they had the upper hand. They brought 7 spits of iron, v'chipum beba'atz. They covered them with ba'atz, lead. They covered them with lead. Yitchilu lahadlik. In other words, they turned these iron spits into sort of makeshift vessels that they would be able to put lights on the top and light from. And pshute kli barzel. I won't go into the halachas of this, but they apparently took spits because it would avoid certain halachic issues from non-tara. I'll just put it like that. But you notice there's a lot of things going on here, and I, really prepared for this time, and I apologize. And it goes on. I'm not. Maybe we'll go on and look at it a little bit, but there are a number of questions that we should raise just in terms of its, what we've read about itself. So in the first part is the part that we seem to be familiar with, that has to do with only finding enough oil for one day, but it burned for 8 days. Then it goes into this whole thing about why is Hanukkah 8 days and not 7 days. So one of the texts that they're bringing along the way is the Nisiim. Well, the Nisiim, brought korbanot and offerings every day, but they did it actually for 12 days, not for 7 days. So it's not clear to me exactly what they're, even though they say B'yom Rishon u'Bashvi'i Griv Ephraim, it's not clear to me what do they do with the other 5 days. Like, that's still a problem. I'm not sure exactly how to understand that. And then, yes.
Where is the Pach Hashem mentioned in the Gemara?
It's in the Gemara on Shabbat in Perek Bameh Madlikin. I can show you that.
And there are differences between this story and what you find in the Gemara, because I understand that the halacha goes according to the Gemara, of course, because you said that Megillat Ta'anit can't be used for the halacha.
What, as I said, Megillat, it's Batel Megillat Ta'anit, except for Hanukkah and the Purim, I think, are the two exceptions.
Except, nevertheless, yeah.
Yeah, Hanukkah is an exception. Hanukkah is one of the only things that still remains as halacha from Megillat Ta'anit. But it's just a second. You know what? I'll have to prepare this a little bit better too, because since we're coming on to Hanukkah, it'll be interesting to see this. But I'll just show you the parallel. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat seems to quote Megillat Ta'anit, and it's not the only place it seems to quote Megillat Ta'anit or a certain version of Megillat Ta'anit. Hold on a second. No. Hold on. Or the Gemara says, "My Chanukah." I'm not finding it. But it's an Amud Bet. Hold on, I'll find it like this. This is the cheating way. Oh, okay. Here we go. So here, the Gemara here in Shabbat, it starts to get into almost all the halachot of Hanukkah come from this sugya on Shabbat in Perek Bameh Madlikin, and you know from reading Bameh Madlikin on Friday night that it's talking about. It starts off by talking about different kinds of oils or fuels and different kinds of wicks that one may or may not use to light candles for Shabbat. So there's a discussion about, we may revisit some of that sugya for our, for the regular part of this year, because there's also a discussion there about what was used for the menorah and the Beit Mikdash. And then there's this discussion about what you can use to light Hanukkah candles. And eventually the Gemara sort of jumps into talking about that question about what you can use for lighting candles, what implications that has for Hilchot Hanukkah. For example, if you light the Hanukkah candles and they go out, are you obliged to relight them? That has to do with the kinds of fuels and wicks that were used, and that indicates to us the halacha one way or the other. And so then at some point, like in the middle of this discussion, the Gemara says, "My Hanukkah." So literally, "My Hanukkah" is what is Hanukkah. Rashi here says, "Al eza nes kvarua," on which, what nes was it based on? The Tanu Rabbanan, because we learn in a Braita, and then the Braita that they quote, you'll see it's in the language of Megillat Ta'anit. The Kafei Bekislev, Yomi de Chanukah Tamanya Inun, the Lolimisped Bahon Udaloli Hitanot, almost word for word. It's a slightly different version. It's almost word for word what we saw in Megillat Ta'anit, right? 8 days of Chanukah. These 8 days of Hanukkah, beginning on the 25th of Kislev, that one may not eulogize during them and one may not fast during them. And then it tells the story, when they came into the Beit Mikdash, they made all of the oils tamei. בדקו ולא מצאו אלא פח אחד של שמן שהיה מונח בחותמו של כהן גדול, ולא היה בו אלא הדליק יום אחד. נעשה בו נס והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים. בשנה אחרת קבעו ויעשו טובים בהלל בהודעה. So this is almost verbatim the version that we see in Megillat Ta'anit. And so we see that they had, like that the Tanaim certainly had Megillat Ta'anit, and it was an early kind of halachic reference. And this was what they used as a halachic basis for Chukah. And since I didn't really prepare all the rest of that, and it goes on, B'li Neder, there are 2 things that I want to do next time. One of them is I would like, or at least in the future, I want to explain better the layout of Beit HaMoked and understand where everything was. There are very interesting differences of opinion, the exact placement of the whole structure of the Beit HaMoked, and also what its shape was, and what the shapes of the different lishkot were, and then, but maybe for Hanukkah we should go through the rest of that part of Megillat Ta'anit. But anyway, Shira, thank you for asking that question. I had learned, the first time I learned Mishnah, like to go through all of Mishnah, I went through using different Perushim, but one of the ones I relied on a lot was Albeck, because Albeck is very easy to understand, and on the one hand, but also he was a great scholar, and he has very good notes at the end where he goes into great depth about particular issues. And this is one of the things that is into. The other thing, by the way, for people who use or want to use Albeck, a lot of times Perush doesn't seem to agree with most of the other Perushim, like the Rambam or the Bartanura or Rashi or so forth. But, and to show you an example of that when we talk about the Beit HaMoked. But you should know that everything that he writes was based on solid sources. And a lot of times he's quoting Rishonim that were not the more widely accepted opinion, but he may have chosen their opinion because it was just easier to understand the Mishnah the way they explain it. So that's a complete digression. So as we finish now I hope we all have a better understanding of these stones that were buried in the Beit HaMoked. It's quite a fascinating story. And personally, I find it interesting, this connection, both historically, like like our Mishnah, which was compiled and redacted much later, right? Not until like the 3rd century. Talking about something that happened hundreds of years earlier. So the tradition survived, and it was part of an oral tradition that became part of Masechet Midot, that remembered or alluded to this act that had taken place during the time of the Hasmoneans. By the way, also, I'll leave you with one other thought. Those of you, like, I think most or all of you, most of you, we learned Masechet Ta'anit. If you remember in Masechet Ta'anit, there's it talks about this idea of if you need to fight an invading force on Shabbat, that you're allowed to go over the Tchum. You're allowed to carry your weapons with you. And that was, they don't say it in the Mishnah, but it's also an allusion to the way this story comes down in the time of the Hasmoneans, because at first what we understood just from the little bit that we read, the Jews kind of divided into 2 camps. So the ones who went with the Hellenists, and they went whole, as it were, to become, to follow the edicts of the Hellenist king. And then there were the Jews who kept the Torah. And one of the things to them is they were attacked. The Hellenists understood that the best time to attack these Jews who had gone off to hide in the mountains, it's the best time to attack them is on Shabbat, because on Shabbat they're not pick up muktzah things and they're not going to fight. And that's exactly what happened. And people were slaughtered. And they said, it's better for us to die this way, like, essentially they martyred themselves to keep Shabbat. And so it was, and that time it's described, and it doesn't use the same language that Chazal uses exactly, but there was like a takana. They decided, like, we can't do this anymore, because if we do it, then we'll all get wiped out and Torah will be completely lost, right? And so that was where the heter comes from for carrying weapons on Shabbat. And then all of a sudden, they couldn't, they were no longer such a soft target. So anyway, it's just interesting. Does anybody want to add something or say something before we end? Okay, you're all stunned. Anyway, it's pretty interesting. I'd wanted to put all of this, like all of the sources for you, like I usually do on sheets, but anybody who wants, if you didn't write it down, I'll send you the sources and you can look for yourself.
Okay.
And in the meantime,
Yeah.
yeah?
Please do
Okay,
it.
so Belina,
Yeah.
I'll copy and paste some of these things for you, so it'll be easier for you to look at them in a more systematic way. So this was a little bit haphazard. There's maybe even one or two more sources that I didn't bring, but if I get them together, I'll put them in. So thank you all for joining. And
Thank you very much. Tודה
Thank
רבה.
you. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב.